and our moderator, Nathalie Wakam. Welcome to the stage. Go get him, sir. Go get him. Boom. Pow.
Hello, hello. Hello. Good morning, everybody. How are you okay? Hope so. So, as you say, I'm Nathalie Wakam from AFRICANEWS. Before we start, I would like to make some points about AFRICANEWS. So, AFRICANEWS is a television based in Pointe-Noire, Congo, obviously Africa. And the point is that AFRICANEWS is a project from Euronews. I guess you know Euronews, one of the biggest TV in Europe. So, Euronews decided to not to be deaf about what people are saying, what magazines are saying, that there are huge opportunities in emerging markets, there are huge opportunities in Africa. So Euronews has decided to create AFRICANEWS in Africa because there were needs for Pan-African information, credible information. And for me, that's the point. That is, the speakers have that profile. They are taking the risk of investing in human or investing in project, investing in trying to shape the ecosystem of technology in Africa. So I think that we are going to start with Aaron Fu. Yeah, Aaron? Yes, Aaron. So you are the managing director of MEST. MEST is Meltwater Entrepreneurial School of Technology. So it could be interesting for us to tell you, what are you doing exactly?
Sure. So thanks for having us. MEST is Africa's largest tech incubator. We're actually celebrating our 10 years this year. We have incubators in Lagos, in Accra, in Cape Town, in Nairobi, and Abidjan as well. So we're not forgetting Francophone Africa. Okay. We have currently 35 companies in the portfolio, and our mission really is to create rockstar entrepreneurs in Africa, and not just have them on stage, not just have them on stages like SEEDSTARS, but also make them incredibly rich. So that's sort of a little bit what we do. Okay,
Zachariah, you are one of the co-founder of STARTUPBOOTCAMP Africa. So recently you created a new program, like program accelerator for startup. How unique is that program? Because we have a lot of people saying that we are coming to Africa or anywhere, any other part of the world to bring that specificity, that technicality. What are you doing exactly?
Thank you. So just as Aaron mentioned, MEST is the largest incubator on the African continent. Startup Bootcamp is the largest accelerator on the African continent. We are a multi-corporate backed accelerator, which essentially means that large corporations across financial services, insurance, retail, telcos, work with innovative founders of tech startups all across the African continent to scale and grow them in a way that helps them shrink typically 18 to 24 months of growth into 3 to 6 months. And we work specifically with mentors all across the world, with investors, to help them scale in a way that is relevant to the African market. Startup Bootcamp is a global accelerator in 17 cities across the world, and we launched the first Africa operations last year.
Okay, so Charlie, you are from SEEDSTARS, and the point is that you have a kind of philosophy saying that we need to find talents everywhere, and you are almost in 70 countries, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's not really one word to describe what SEEDSTARS is, so I can't say we're an incubator or an accelerator. But I guess maybe with 2 words, what we are is an ecosystem catalyzer. So we try and have different programs for startup ecosystems in emerging economies, and programs that are kind of adapted to the stage or the life cycle of that ecosystem. So normally it starts off with very nascent systems. We'll do events, so pitching events, startup competitions. Then it might develop into short training modules, startup weekend style things. And then moving on, we have academy programs, which is like a pre-acceleration. We then have accelerator programs, and then we also have a post-accelerator. So really depending on the stage of the ecosystem, we try and offer something that's relevant. And like you said, yeah, I mean, it's not just Africa. Africa is probably our strongest region. Yes,
that's what
it's where we've definitely spent the most time and effort since we launched 5 years ago. But it is, yeah, like you said, about 65 countries, 80 ecosystems. Yeah. And in Africa, it's currently Nigeria, Ivory Coast. We're just opening in Tanzania, which is exciting, and South Africa.
Okay. So, Zachariah, the team today is about creating those ecosystems in emerging countries. Let's take the example of South Africa. In South Africa, you have a town like Cape Town that is described like the biggest hub of startup in Africa. What is the particularity of Cape Town? Why do you think it's like that? Is it about policies by the government? What is your stand on that?
So that's a very good question. So I'll take a step back. So if you look at what makes Silicon Valley ripe for innovation, you've got a good blend of 5 factors. You've got universities and research centers that spit out graduates that want to work for startups and not just in the academic field. You've got a large pool of risk capital available in the valley. You've got a similar thing in Cape Town in South Africa. You've got a very active provincial Western Cape government that looks at tax subsidies for early stage tech entrepreneurs. You've got a very active corporate sector that looks at establishing, outsourcing innovation through accelerators and incubators. And then, of course, you've got a very good design, development, digital media community in Cape Town. So all these 5 factors together create an ecosystem that help entrepreneurs grow and flourish. And that makes Cape Town the Silicon Cape of Africa.
Can I just add quickly, the other thing I love about Cape Town is that, because we just opened our offices there last year, is that it's got a strong tradition of investors making a lot of money from investing into startups. So there actually has been a lot of return on capital there, which is less so yet in other African ecosystems.
Africa. Absolutely.
So apparently you have strong link with South Africa, Cape Town, from what we are getting.
Yes, so we just launched in Cape Town last year. So we're very excited to be there and tap into the rich ecosystem that Zach just described.
So what is sure is that there is a lot of enthusiasm about startup. Startups are created every day, but the point is that a lot of startups didn't really succeed. So, yes. So, what are the main keys for you to give those startups means to evolve?
To evolve, wow. Okay. So first of all, I think startup failure is a must to have. I think most of them don't succeed, and that's okay. That's very natural. So let's not try and save all of them. I think the biggest thing that we do that's a little bit different is we actually are based on a training program, which is pre-team, pre-idea. So that's our pipeline. And we find it really important to give these aspiring entrepreneurs 1 year, not just the skills, but also this runway where they don't have to worry about rent and food and all that. Because I think a lot of entrepreneurs get distracted along the way, especially in Africa, where they have this product they want to build, but then they have to make rent, so then they do these consulting projects, and then they get distracted along the way. So I think a big thing that we do is we give them a period in which you can focus on building a business.
What about you, Charlie? That you identify those who can make it. What type of project are you more interested in? Is it about the originality, the utility of the type of...
It's got to be really concrete. We're not really into, I don't know, another platform that has been seen and done 100 times, but it's really concrete. So, I mean, the things we're interested in have a large market. So, I mean, financial services, health services, agricultural tech, ed tech. Those are the, I guess, 4 key sectors where you have a large population, you know that there's very little tech being used in those economies or in those industries at the moment, so it's kind of ripe for disruption, and tech can really make a difference. So those are, I'd say, the 4 real focus sectors, and then in terms of how you help the startups, it depends the stage of the ecosystem. So what MEST are doing very well is from, I guess, the grassroots, giving these guys a year just to test their ideas. So for there to be companies that VCs can invest in or corporates can acquire, you need this kind of pipeline of early stage ideas being incubated. So we kind of jump in, I would say, slightly after that. So once they've probably been through MEST, it's a formal team. They've maybe raised some friends, family, fools, sort of angel round. And then we'll generally come in at that stage with either an acceleration program or a growth program. So again, it's like Zach was saying, you try and condense a lot of help, a lot of support into a 3-month period and just accelerate that growth.
Yes.
The key thing to add from an Africa perspective, I think most folks in the audience are wondering why this is an Africa panel. So the key thing to remember here is you can't just Control-C, Control-V Silicon Valley and make it work in Africa. You can't go from 100 customers to 100,000 customers in 2 months like in Silicon Valley. You have to look at what makes an emerging market ecosystem different? And the most important thing to figure out here is, what is my cost of customer acquisition, right? The cost of customer acquisition in Africa is exceptionally high, but the customer lifetime value is very long, which is a good thing. So the one thing you got to figure out is, if I want to go from 100 customers to 1 million customers, I have to be able to do it in a strategic way. And one of the only ways to do that is to work with large corporates, insurance companies, banks, retailers, telcos, etc. So even if you have a B2C business model, try and see if you can pivot that to a B2B2C business model. And that works exceptionally well in Africa. So most of the companies that we look at, we just crossed 1,000 applications for our accelerator this year. We will pick the top 10, and I can tell you the majority of our top companies are B2B or B2B2C. And in Africa and emerging markets in general, that is very, very important. And that helps the venture capitalists also de-risk themselves. So that's something very important to keep in mind when you look at choosing the right companies to back.
So, Charlie, when we are talking about emerging market, we see Africa and some places in Asia. So, from your personal experience, how far is the building of the ecosystem in Africa is compared, for instance, to Asia?
When did things start off in Ghana? Remind me the year. That was like the first incubation program. It wasn't MEST, it was someone else, right?
Yeah, probably.
I can't remember what year it was. I think Kenya, it's maybe 2003, 5 with K-Lab. So I mean, it's still very young, and I mean, I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on how long it takes for an ecosystem to become, let's say, successful. And if we say successful, I would say it's kind of statistical significance, how many ventures are reaching Series A. So let's say, assume that an ecosystem needs to have 20 VC-backed companies a year. Not many
or
ecosystems
exits
in
or
Africa.
whatever, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, not many, I don't think any ecosystem in Africa has reached that yet, but to reach that, I think it's going to take 10, 15 years. And I mean, I can take the example more from Latin America. Mexico, I think, started off again around the same time, so 2003. So we're 15 years later, and I think only now we're starting to have a sort of critical mass. So it's been 15 years. Now there's 60 VCs in Mexico. There's about 200 fintech startup, whereas 6, 7 years ago there was only 6 VCs and probably 30 fintech startups. So it takes a long time, and I think in Africa we haven't had that. I mean, in a lot of ecosystems, the real initiatives. I mean, you guys started 2 or 3 years ago. Yeah. So yeah, we still need 10 more years.
So on that point, from just taking up on what Charlie just said. So in 2013, the total amount of venture capital activity on the entire African continent, so which is seed, post-seed, and Series A, was $30 million. That's probably one booth over here in Paris. And in 2017, that number is now close to 600 million. Right, so it's an exponential increase, but people wonder why. Why is that happening? Are investors suddenly just a lot more risk tolerant? No, it's because you've got governments, you've got large corporates that understand that innovation has to come from everyone in the ecosystem. So when you have insurance companies, banks, large governments saying we need to back our startups, and not through grants and debt, but through equity, all of a sudden everything changes. And it's also very important to balance corporate M&A with corporate commercial partnerships. And that's something we're seeing very, very, it's one of the best signs that I've seen personally in Africa, and Aaron will sort of agree with that as well, I think.
Yeah, so I think I love Charlie's point around how there isn't this one magic bullet, and there's no fast track towards building an ecosystem. It takes a very long time. And I think from my perspective, it's very encouraging to see the amount of sort of Series A and Series B raises increase. It means that we're more comfortable investing more at the seed stage. But what's interesting to see for me is if you think about an ecosystem as sort of a series of pebbles across a river, each one is incredibly critical to get built in order to get to the end. But what I've seen is some markets are just skipping a lot of these and trying to force startups to jump from sort of one stage to the next, whereby, and then they just fall, right? But what's a little bit frustrating is that sometimes a pebble will appear, and then the business model doesn't work, or something else doesn't work, and then it disappears, and is actually damaging to the entire ecosystem. You really kind of feel it's lost. So that's a bit sad for me.
How difficult is it for for investors, for instance, because there's a lot is said about African country governance, corruption, yes. So how difficult is it really to invest in a startup locally?
I mean, so it's funny you say that. I had the privilege of meeting Tim Draper for dinner 2 days ago. And for someone like him who's extremely sophisticated, one of the top VCs in the entire planet, he had a similar comment. Well, isn't Africa a place where you still have dictators and it's wild? And I said, no. So I think a big part of the story is this. There is so much interesting fintech, insurtech, artificial intelligence, big data, some beautiful pieces of tech being built every day in Africa. But the story does not make it past our shores. That's why having an event like this where the African story is told in a public forum, where we know that there are entrepreneurs solving problems in electronic health records, in peer-to-peer insurance, in money transfers, in agri-tech, so solving real-world problems versus building the next $400 juicing company in San Francisco. So the beauty of Africa is if the people in the room here and your friends can build tech products that solve real problems, Africa is your target market. So we have to build more aspirins and less vitamins. Because at some point, the world's population, which is going more and more negative in the West and going all the way up here. I mean, every third person on this planet will be from Africa in 2100. So let's use our resources to build tech solutions that actually solve real problems, and Africa is a hotbed for that.
I mean, it is true, though, that there are constraints and, I mean, friction for investors to get into Africa, but there's ways around it. So people do offshore, they set up a structure in Mauritius or in Delaware or wherever. So there are ways around it, but it's friction. And for me, the role of governments, and I'm sure there's some here today, should be removing those frictions. And a really good example, in Kazakhstan, they just set up a sort of economic free zone under English law. I mean, Kazakhstan, you know, it's Russian language, Central Asia. Most investors probably don't even know where it is on the map. But they've set up this economic free zone under English law and making it super easy for people to invest. I mean, they've got tax incentives, things like that. So there are ways of making it easier and reducing that friction. And of course, it's going to help because everyone has this image of it's Wild West, it's dictatorship. But you need to have sort of bold initiatives like that are then communicated, that are communicated cross borders, that reach, you know, the US or wherever the funding is in Europe, and then people will start to look more.
Can I just add a quick counterpoint, right? So I think if we look at all the friction, I think the friction actually represents the opportunity. So a lot of times when you have public sector failures, it actually represents massive opportunities for private startups to actually step in and actually build something that's at scale, right? So I think it's very important that while we accept that there are a lot of these limitations and friction, I think it's important that we just flip it and just go, actually, it's an opportunity.
Okay, so we have some question from the audience. That is, what motivation do you have to support, accelerate, incubate specific startup in Africa? Zachariah, Charlie.
I think we covered that, didn't we? Work with large institutions to reduce your route to market. That would probably be my biggest point.
I think from our point of view, our motivations really are to create role models and superstars that the next generation can look up to. The story I always use is, you know, we see a lot of African villages where the kids try and build a soccer ball and kick it around because on TV they see it as, you know, bright, young, you know, rich African who's managed to make it through sport. We want to make it so that he picks up a computer instead and builds a tech business. And so really our mission and our motivation is to inspire the next.
And success is a catalyst. So one success story is going to catalyze a whole generation or multiple generations of entrepreneurs. So.
Okay, maybe the second question is interesting. Advice to a prospective entrepreneur in an emerging economy. What will it be?
Which one?
So if you need to give one advice to a prospective entrepreneur.
Jeez, I'd say start small. Like start with what your community needs. Start with what your city needs. Like don't try and copy San Francisco. Like don't try and solve massive problems that the world needs, because there are a lot of problems that your community, your city, your town needs, and use technology to scale that. So, yeah, I mean, there's this misconception that if you have to make it big, you have to go and join Y Combinator or 500 Startups and move to the Valley. You don't have to. You can make a sustainable, scalable business model being in South Africa or Nigeria or Ghana, provided you know how to do it smartly.
I think if it was one thing that I would say to someone that's really starting would be, you're in for the hardest time of your life. Yeah. Be very sure you want to do this. I think the story about building startups is always about building a plane as it's going off a cliff, right? I think in emerging economies, it's like that, except with a blindfold. Like it's probably the hardest thing you will ever do in your life, so be sure.
Okay. What are the minimum requirements a region should have to start the ecosystem? Because at times people, for Africa instead, people are saying that we need to solve major issue, health issue, that is maybe developing the ecosystem of technology is not the priority. So?
Maybe I'll answer that one and the one that's at Charlie as well, because I think they're linked. So the way I look at an ecosystem is, Zach said 5 things. For me, it's 3, but it's basically the same. It's the culture, the environment, and the opportunity. And so you don't need anything. You don't need anything to start. You've got to start with something, though, and for me, that's the culture. And you build the culture by, as we were saying, creating role models, doing events, having different talks like this in the ecosystems, and really changing the mindset of the entrepreneurs. And when you have that, I think the next thing is the environment, and this is one of the KPIs. So, okay, KPIs for the culture is, how many events are going on, how many people, what's the percentage fear of failure, people are measuring that. Who considers, or how many people consider entrepreneurship as an attractive career choice. So there are ways of measuring the culture, and that's kind of responding to the KPIs. Then, you have the environment, which is, I think, the government's responsibility of reducing that friction we were talking about. I think it's a different friction. Like, I like your point, friction in the market and failures of the public is opportunities for startups. But there's friction, like, just as can you invest in the country, which I think should be solved by the government. Is there access to internet? Is there access to electricity? Things like that. And then finally, it's the opportunity, and that's easy to measure. It's access to funding, it's access to talents, and then it's the market size. So, we were talking about the number, Zach was saying the amount of VC capital invested in Africa, that's the KPI. How much is invested in that ecosystem? How long does it take to hire a developer? Like, how much does it cost? So there's various KPIs for all of the different stages.
Also, I'd say to add that from a pure investment perspective, if you look at what Mauritius has done in the last couple of decades. So Mauritius is the only green fund on the entire African continent. What I mean by that is it's clean, it's above the surface. Did you know that Mauritius has a 0% capital gains tax rate on any LPs coming into your fund? And if you have your IP in Mauritius, and you want to move your IP overseas to anywhere in the world, to India, to China, to the UK, to the US, you pay 0% IP transfer tax. Now, the Mauritian government knows that that's a long-term play, and a lot of funds now globally, even in the US and Europe, are moving their funds to Mauritius. So imagine if more African countries came up with those initiatives. I'm not saying it's only a government thing, but the private sector has to lobby towards creating the right incentives for people to come and do business in Africa. And venture capital is a key part of that.
Thank you. Charlie? This one is...
I answered that one.
Yes, okay.
Charlie, someone's hitting on you, dude.
So question for Charlie.
Next.
Yes. I guess we all tackle this preoccupation of the audience on the general...
I'd like to talk about the third point there and maybe possibly get people's views here, because that is a very important thing. How do you raise awareness of the amazing tech being built in Africa? Where would you start? I'd like to put it out there to everyone here who holds a camera on behalf of a media firm. You need to be able to tell better stories of African entrepreneurs doing amazing things. We need to be able to tell stories about my friend who's building a diagnostic center to predict the early onset of malaria, of diabetes, using Oculus technology. People that are doing fantastic things that no one hears about. Why? Because it's in the deepest, darkest parts of Africa that no one cares about. So I'd like CNN, I'd like BBC, I'd like all these big news agencies to start saying, we don't want just smart, sexy stories from the US and from Western Europe. We want to tell stories that do good, And I think media exposure is a critical component of selling the Africa story. So I'd like to say media is...
If I'm not doing kind of advertisement, but it's what AFRICANEWS is trying to do on the... That is, you cannot avoid a terrorist attack or whatever, but we are trying to show the success Africa who is succeeding. So I think that things are changing gradually.
If we can clone like 2,000 of you, we'd be in a better place next year at VivaTech. So we got to work on that.
Okay, thank you. So, sir, I don't know, maybe it's the time to conclude. We all said
Thanks
what
very
was
much,
necessary.
Nathalie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.